Okay, Tom.
Thank you, Lou. And welcome all of whom in the audience, returning participants, and a special welcome to those who are joining in for the first time. My name is Tom Finger. I am delighted to be both the coordinator of this series and the speaker this evening. I'm drawing upon my experience as an academic at Stanford and as having held senior positions in Washington for a little more than 20 years. The topic this evening is China and the Quad. I think the title in the Great Decisions Workbook is Xi Jinping and the Quad. For those who have not read the article or are unfamiliar with the term, the Quad, which I suspect is many people because it's not well known. But the Quad is a grouping of countries that consists of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. In some ways, this grouping reminds me of Sesame Street groupings when I used to watch it with my children, where the question was, which one doesn't fit? Which ones are not like the other ones in this? The logic that brings these four countries together is not clear, is variable, but loosely is based on the idea that all are democracies, specifically electoral democracies, even though there is substantial differences among them. That I'll have more to say about what the Quad is in a moment. But for purposes of the talk, I should observe up front that China hates the Quad. It's very distressed by critical of the existence of this grouping of states. And yet, somewhat ironically, the group exists as it does primarily in reaction to actions undertaken by the People's Republic of China. Stated another way, if China had not acted as it has over the last several years, it's unlikely that this particular group of countries would exist or would have more than a completely nominal existence. So what I'm going to do this evening in my talk is begin with a discussion of the genesis and the purpose of the Quad, but also to note what observers imagine or fear or want the Quad to be. That in kind of reviewing what I already thought I knew about the Quad, I was involved in the Bush administration and early efforts to establish this group, but reviewing more recent commentary and critiques of this organization, it's a Rorschach test that people see and imagine or impute very different purposes and characteristics to this grouping. Some imagine or want it to be much more than it is. Others imagine or want it to be much less than it in fact is. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. I'll talk about why China dislikes the Quad. What is the reason or the set of reasons that the existence of a grouping, the collaboration among these particular states is so distressing to Beijing? And then finally, I'll try to put the Quad, this organization, into a broader context and specifically link it to lessons that are being drawn, will be drawn, should be drawn from what is happening in Ukraine. the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As before I begin that talk, I would observe for those of you who read the Great Decisions article by Kevin Rudd on Xi Jinping and the Quad. Rudd's article has been substantially overtaken by developments, mostly in Ukraine. The portions on the background of the Quad remain useful. The portions describing China's response and efforts to deal with the existence and imputed objectives are almost completely wrong. Not because Kevin Rudd is not a smart guy, he is. I've known him for quite some time. Actually, before he was the Prime Minister of Australia, and I interact with him still on a fairly frequent basis. But this illustrates the speed with which situations, developments can change in the international arena. So an article that was probably completed 3 or 4 months ago is quite badly out of date. But let me turn now to some of the origins and the objectives of the Quad. I've subtitled this portion of the talk, Reality and Imagination. I'll frame the discussion with a couple of observations. The first is that contrary to the title used by Great Decisions, the Quad is not an alliance. I repeat that, the Quad is not an alliance. It's not a security alliance. It's not a military alliance. It's not a formal grouping with documents laying out the obligations and responsibilities of the members. Instead, it is a grouping of sometimes like-minded states with democracy in quotes as the primary common denominator. There's no formal structure. There are no security commitments, no obligations to come to the aid of one another, except to the extent that those obligations exist because of other formal agreements. The United States-Japan Security Alliance, for example, the US-Australia Alliance, or the more recent Australia-United Kingdom-US alliance structure. But within the Quad structure, there are no mutual obligations or commitments. The Great Decision description is not appropriate, but calling the Quad an alliance reflects the aspirations of some inside and outside of the United States, inside and outside of the other countries in this grouping. But it also reflects the fears of China in particular and some other countries. Some want it to be much more than it is. Some want it to be a formal security agreement with binding commitments. Others fear that it might become one. And much of the commentary treats it as if it had already become an alliance. Much in the way that on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, people talked about Ukraine as an ally of the United States or an ally as a part of NATO. Ukraine is neither of those. In East Asia, Taiwan is often discussed in the same terminology as if it were an ally. It has not been an ally since January 1, 1980, when the US formally terminated the security agreement that dates from the 1950s. There are competing perceptions and aspirations of what this grouping can be, should be, is, or should not become. And commentary is generally confusing because it confuses existence of what is and what the writers wish it to be or fear that it would be. We may get some indications of how the Biden administration views this grouping, may wish to use this grouping or to shape this grouping coming out of the responses to the invasion of Ukraine. And I'll return to this at the close of my talk. But let me go back to the beginning and talk about the genesis of the grouping known as the Quad. The Quad, in my view, comes very close to meeting the requirements of a solution looking for a problem. The solution is to combine in some way a subset of countries in the Indo-Pacific region that have democratic governments. The unstated next sentences and have some type or types of disagreements and problems with China. But it is a group that came together with expectations on the part of some, maybe many, that if the group was fine, to build it and they will come. Establish the organization and it'll figure out what to do. Establish the organization, and since these are mostly similarly minded governments, they'd find common cause and find ways to cooperate in pursuit of those shared objectives. The problem is normally assigned or described as China, a rising China, a more assertive China, a big China, a big Chinese military, a large Chinese economy. All of these are pretty vague or pretty well unsubstantiated. They're assertions. Mostly, I think the terminology of solution looking for a problem is an accurate description. Where did it come from? How did this originate? I date the origins of it to the latter part of the Clinton administration, when the administration led by then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright floated the idea of establishing a community of democracies. This was early in the period of increased awareness of incompatible objectives and methods in democratic states and authoritarian states. It was in the heyday, the high tide of democratization after the end of the Cold War, where many nations either restored democratic governments or put them in place for the first time. I say the high tide of democracies in this period because it has begun to recede, that the number of democracies is decreasing and the quality, particularly the liberal dimension of democracies, is receding, including in the United States, many would argue. And I would be on the side of that argument. It's receding in the United States. But there was an idea that democracies needed to talk to one another, needed to have a place to share best practices, needed to have the objective as well as the mechanisms to support one another, to strengthen them, to overcome difficulties, to work in common when it was in their interest to do so. The idea did not go very far. A meeting was held, but it didn't amount to much. It kind of went dormant until during the Bush administration, Bush 43, George W. Bush, when there was a different motivation and mechanism that the American ambassador to Australia, Tom Schiefer, was appointed after his term in Australia to be ambassador to Japan. And having served both places, Schiefer thought that we needed more formal mechanisms to enable Japan, Australia, and the United States to collaborate, to cooperate, to exchange information, exchange intelligence, share information that would lead to military coordination, adopt compatible economic and trade policies, and the like. It was an idea that there are a lot of similarities in these three countries that could be utilized to achieve common objectives. It wasn't a bad idea, but it went absolutely nowhere. There was no enthusiasm for this idea, in part, I think, because it had no clear purpose. There was not a lot of enthusiasm for a build it and we'll figure out the purpose later way of tackling the challenges of building yet another multinational institution. But another reason that it went nowhere in this period was that none of the candidate states of these four, US, Japan, Australia, and India, wanted the appearance of an anti-China, in quotes, alliance, end quotes, that for their own reasons, the United States linked to the war on terror, linked to desire to secure Chinese cooperation in managing the North Korean nuclear problem, Japan for trade-related reasons, Australia, again, for economic related reasons, and India because it was very wary of even the appearance of an alliance with the United States or anybody else that would impugn its neutralist credentials. So it didn't go anywhere. It lay moribund until roughly 2017, when things changed in ways that were sparked by a combination of the personalities and proclivities of the political leadership in the countries, and more importantly, by People's Republic of China's actions, actions in the region and beyond. Let me start with the United States. That President Trump's confused and confusing positions on trade were a shaping factor. That one of the very first things that he did after he was inaugurated was to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership economic and trade agreement that had been negotiated by the previous administration and would have established the largest in terms of trade volume sub-global group in the world, that it accounted for about 40% of US trade, and he withdrew. And this was important because the TPP, as it was known, was designed to provide some architecture, some structure to East Asia. East Asia, unlike Europe, has very, very few institutional structures except legacy bilateral alliances like US-Japan, US-South Korea, China and North Korea, and trade, markets, market integration. And markets are very good for efficient allocation of economic resources. They're not very good for anything else. They don't provide a security pillar. They don't provide a basis for diplomacy in tackling a wide range of social and political issues. The TPP was designed to do that. Also, Trump's positions on China, that I think even more than the former president, others in the administration had a very hostile posture towards China. And the Quad was seen as a way of constraining China, limiting China's rise, limiting China's ability to expand its influence in the region and beyond. At about the same time in Japan, then Prime Minister Abe looked upon the Quad differently than he had previously, and than his predecessors had, because with the US withdrawing from TPP, he was looking for a way to keep the United States engaged in the region beyond the bilateral security alliance. He wanted the US ties to Asia to be based on more than the enemy of my enemy can be my friend. With the disappearance of the Soviet Union, the only conceivable common enemy would be China. And that was not a very palatable, politically palatable basis for a relationship in Japan. In Australia, the real impetus comes later, after 2020, when China announced that it was going to punish Australia for demanding an independent investigation of the origins of COVID-19. That the Chinese took great umbrage at this. They put barriers and tariffs on a range of Australian products that were major exports to China. And to say the least, it thoroughly angered the political leadership in Canberra. India, which had been the most standoffish of the four before the summer of 2020, was motivated to be more interested by border clash. Troops of China and India clash pretty much every spring, high up in the Himalayas. As the snow melts, the two forces that are way up there, they're up above 12,000 feet, most of them, began to clash. And Modi made the clash into a bigger political incident than he had, or than his predecessors had in previous years. Say these things happen every year since 1962. But mostly they're contained, few die, if any. But this time, Modi made it a much bigger deal, possibly to divert attention from the very poor performance of his government in handling the COVID crisis. This was a time of very, very large numbers of deaths, and inability to provide hospital care, even to dispose of the bodies. So you've got these reasons that center on China to an extent that motivated the leadership in the four parties to reconsider a grouping that had been dubbed the Quad and is now again called the Quad. When Joe Biden took office, the Quad began to be viewed through the lens that he had articulated during the campaign. of rebuilding partnerships, rebuilding alliances, strengthening democracies, finding coalition partners, like-minded partners to tackle global challenges like climate change, like proliferation of nuclear weapons. So he entered office with the counterpart countries more interested in a grouping, some type of a grouping, and he entered it with a vision that was pro something rather than anti-China, and that had appeal. Now, each of the countries or leaders had different motivations, but they were compatible. And they favored resurrection of this old idea called the Quad. It was reborn in the context of multi-state tensions, most of them with China at the center, and political pressures in each of the countries to respond in some ways to Chinese actions and to assertions and to imagined prospects for what China sought to achieve. That these included China's substantial military buildup, which began in the 1990s and continues to this day. Its more assertive postures and deployment of force in the Sea of Japan and in the South China Sea. It's in the context of US retrenchment after Iraq and Afghanistan, and the need to rebuild our military after 20 years of conflict. Rebuilding it for Asian distances and Asian contingencies made a lot of sense. Did not even have to assume that the greatest danger of conflict was in Asia. It made sense to build for Asian distances, because if you can fly far enough to get from A to B in Asia, you can cover anything in Europe or in Africa or the Middle East. So you'd covered all best specs. Up until now, we have built for European distances and equipment for a land war in Europe, not for a naval and air engagement in Asia. If we could figure out ways to do this in coordination, in collaboration with large partners in the region, we could get greater efficiency and lower costs by building equipment for multiple buyers and for integrating our defense capabilities so we didn't need as much as we would need if we were to do it completely by ourselves. Modi had stirred up nationalist passions after the COVID fiasco. So there was greater willingness among his constituencies to enter into quasi-security relationship with the United States, which India had studiously avoided since the time of independence in 1947. And China's efforts to exert economic leverage on Japan and Australia made the publics in those countries eager to have some type of a response by their own government. And the vagueness of what the Quad was had the terrific advantage that you could feel good about forging a new organization that was there in part to deal with a China challenge, but it wasn't blatantly aggressive, assertive to China or to anybody else. So it was kind of a safe grouping that made you feel better And it might actually enable you to do some things more easily than you otherwise would have been able to do. There were people in all of the countries, including the United States, who wanted the Quad to become an anti-China alliance in the same way that the network of existing alliances that the United States has around the world that were formed to deal with the Soviet menace, the Soviet threat, or the Sino-Soviet threat as it existed from 1949 to 1969. This was a press for more military spending, for more spending on certain types of systems, which affected how much money would flow into different states within the United States, more shipbuilding, more airplanes, more or fewer ground weapons, and the like. The security policy reasons, burden sharing, coordination, integration, made a great deal of sense. It makes sense in Europe. It's gone quite far within NATO. It has not gone far at all in Asia. One of the missing countries, if you will, from the Quad grouping is South Korea. So if this is a group of democracies, this is a group of countries that have issues with China, this is a group of countries with important economic and social ties to the United States. Why isn't South Korea in it? The short answer is the degree of tension between South Korea and Japan. And Tom Schiefer was ambassador in Japan, not to South Korea. So the genesis of this shaped, in a funny way, the limitation to 4 countries. The declarations that the Quad was an anti-China alliance, though not true, they confirmed the worst of China's fears, that the imperialist countries, the capitalist countries, the democratic countries were banding together to contain and constrain, to surround and to challenge China and undermine its regional standing, undermine the legitimacy of its government. Mostly these are paranoid delusions, but that doesn't make them unimportant to decision-making in Beijing any more than it makes them irrelevant to decision-making in Washington. We seldom call them in our own country paranoid delusions. We call them prudent realism, prudent worst-case analysis, preparing for things you don't actually think will happen, but you want to be ready in case they do. Which is why we actually spend some money and devote effort to guarding against runaway meteor strikes or attacks from aliens somewhere in the galaxy. Not a lot, but some. China was not the only country that was rendered uneasy by the greater reality of the Quad. China, as a large country, generally dislikes multilateral arrangements for the same reason that other large countries do, and some in the United States do. The United States is the oddball, not just in the contemporary era, but in world history, in being a large country that has made the decision to pursue our own security and prosperity in collaboration with as many other countries as are willing and able to join our efforts. That the reason big countries don't like multilateral agreements is a purpose of many of them going back to balancing alliances, is the little guys band together to be strong enough to constrain the big guy. So the big guys don't like constraints. This is Gulliver and the Lilliputians. That the Lilliputians, a whole bunch of them, can tie down a strong Gulliver. Multinational institutions, international organizations give greater power to small players acting in concert. The Quad, although they're not small players, Australia is small, but Japan and India and the United States are not. So banding together is for powerful countries. And judged economically, Australia is a big player. Other countries were discomforted by the Quad, are discomforted by it, because they worried about it being destabilizing. They worry about it making China more nervous, more paranoid, more determined to strengthen its deterrent capabilities, nuclear and conventional, more likely to be assertive as a defensive move, that the transition from panda to dragon, to try and deter any kind of economic pressure, certainly deter any military pressure by emphasizing its military strength. And there is a not unreasonable concern that that kind of behavior itself will elicit arms races and other reactions by the United States, by Japan, by India, and by Australia. China, in many ways, has brought about a self-fulfilling prophecy in the military arena. That the United States is rebuilding our military because we burned up a lot of equipment in 20 years of war. And we're not going to rebuild it by building the 1960s and 70s era equipment that we were still using in this century. We're going to build new stuff, which is going to be more capable, which is going to render the recent investments by China and by some other countries somewhat less useful for deterrence or defense purposes. The Chinese build up over a couple of decades that Japan tolerated until a few years ago. The Japanese did not expand their military budgets. They did not begin building in anything like an arms race. They've now lifted the policy limit of 1% of gross domestic product for defense. They are beginning to build more and different weapons. The Indians have viewed themselves in an arms race with China since China began to build up, in part because India, since the demise of the Soviet Union, has no allies. So it's spending a lot on weapons, which increase the threat, among others, to China. And Australia, in the wake of American retrenchment, Chinese pressure, uncertainties in the region, has decided that it must modernize and expand its military forces, grant increased basing opportunities to the United States, and concluded at the end of last year a new security arrangement with the United States and Great Britain, United Kingdom. In many ways, it doesn't change anything because of a lot pre-existing bilateral alliances, but now it's a trilateral one. And one of the specific activities that this grouping is going to undertake is to transfer nuclear power technology for submarines, British and American, to Australia. Australia is so far away from other parts of Asia that conventional submarines have limited utility. Nuclear power allows them to go much further, to remain submerged. So it makes sense, but it's a big jump in terms of capability and in terms of public perceptions of the implications for nuclear weapons proliferation. The Chinese lens that they use in looking at the Quad is one that, even if it doesn't say it's anti-China, because it's described as anti-China by some commentators, it must be. And their prudent response is to interpret the worst case, is that it could be, if it's not already, anti-China, and that's problematic. Its existence widens the gap between China's rhetoric about peaceful rise, mutual benefit for all. China's doing better enables others to do better, which has a great deal of validity to it, and other perceptions of Chinese actions which appear threatening. So there's China's dilemmas are magnified or compounded because of a perceived gap between what it says and what it does, and by the different expectations or aspirations that others have for the Quad. Some want it to become a powerful military actor, and others simply fear that it will, and that if it becomes a more powerful military player, it will destabilize. And there is a line of analysis right now about Ukraine, the one that blames NATO. It was NATO's threat to expand into Ukraine that provoked Putin to invade Ukraine. It's a far-fetched argument, but it's one that is repeated, certainly by China, but also by other countries in East Asia. And the Quad looks like, quacks like, it might be the genesis of an Asian NATO. The Chinese have long denounced existing alliances as outdated relics of the Cold War, and their revitalization as manifestations that we have entered a new Cold War between the West and China. And this sort of hypothetical or contrived argument, for some, is given reality by the existence of the Quad. And to the extent that the Quad is becoming sort of what it is, as a function of Biden administration efforts to restore relationships disrupted or damaged or entirely broken by the Trump administration, but not just put them back where they were or the way that they were, but to transform these groupings into agents for positive change, agents for combating terrorism, for enhancing global health, for fighting the next pandemic, for adding resilience to the effects of climate change. That these kind of transnational global efforts that are going to be needed. They're going to have building block components. Organizing 193 countries to 194, counting us, to act in concert is kind of beyond the capabilities of any mortals I've ever encountered. But the Biden approach is to do this in building block fashion, beginning with like-minded partners. That this is not limited to military allies. It's anybody that can contribute, wants to contribute, and shares interests and values and goals can be a partner. And the Quad, as it's been reconceptualized since last year when it held its first formal summit, very much has a huge characterization as being military, as being anti-China, and very much underscored that its purpose is to collaborate to achieve shared objectives. The PRC rhetoric, Chinese rhetoric, denouncing the formation of the Quad and its imputed purposes, has gained some traction in the region and beyond. In the way in which I characterize it, I understate the persuasiveness of the argument to many other countries that are suspicious of the United States because we exist, because we have been so big, so powerful, so successful. And we need to be counterbalanced by something. That to the extent that we enhance our own reach and power and influence by partnering with other countries, as is done in the Quad, we are seen as having greater potential to run amok. There's nobody to check us, nobody to counter us. There's almost a wistfulness about the halcyon days of yore when the Soviet Union held the Americans in check. Didn't like the Soviet Union, but it was a check on what the United States can do. The potential check for most others as they look at it is China. That causes the Quad to be seen even more of an anti-China. As others talk about it as anti-China, it reinforces the Chinese suspicions. But what is the Quad? Actually, not what do people want it to be or imagine it that it is. In its summit documents from September of last year, the documents go out of the way to avoid saying the word China. They do not characterize it as anti-China. Do most observers interpret the absence of China as meaning there's no concern about China, no anti-China dimension to it? No, they see it as disingenuous and deceitful on the part of the four countries. And we don't even confess the anti-China character to this. They have a point, but they exaggerate it. If one looks at what does the Quad say that it is and is going to do, it's worth taking seriously the shared commitment to global health, to enhancing health security around the world, combating diseases, dealing with pandemic disease, collaboration, coordination for, I think it's 1.3 billion COVID doses that the Quad has agreed to provide free. This takes advantage of American technology, Indian capacity to produce pharmaceuticals of all kinds, vaccines. They're the largest manufacturer in the world, as well as making ourselves safer by making the world healthier. Building high quality infrastructure. That's a Japanese counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese propose to build a lot of infrastructure. Japan says we'll build higher quality, better infrastructure. And it fits with a portion of the Biden agenda that wasn't there in the campaign, or at least I don't remember it from the campaign, but is Build Back Better W. So BBBW, which is Build Back Better at the world level. And this subsumes things like reducing vulnerability, building resistance to sea level rise, making dirty air cleaner for better health and less susceptibility to other forms of illness. Coordination for building infrastructure so that if Australia and the United States and Japan, India is not going to be contributing a lot in terms of money, but it will contribute in terms of construction crews, that it's all part of one coordinated, not competing with one another or building multiple dams on the same river more than it can handle, or coordinating where bridges are built to go where plans are to build highways and ports. Connectivity and coordination. This is a variant of infrastructure. It's the 4 countries will coordinate among themselves, but work to enhance cyber connectivity, integration of transportation systems, water systems, and the like in other parts of the world. Addressing climate change, green transportation, clean hydrogen, resilience to the effects of global warming. It's a combination of putting money on the problem and coordinating efforts to work with other countries as a model for the way in which the US, this administration, hopes to address the range of global challenges. And finally, science and technology cooperation. These are some of the most able scientific, technological institutions in the world are based in these 4 countries. And if they work together, if we work together, the potential for breakthroughs is greater. But if we work together in a way that is exclusive and denies access and participation to others, read China, it's problematic for that country. That the positive agenda that the Quad has articulated makes it hard for Beijing to get traction with third countries in their arguments that this is an institution that should not exist, that has malevolent intent, that is hostile to China, because it's hostile to China, reduces stability and threatens economic prosperity everywhere. That would be an easier argument to make if the Quad had explicit military and defensive motives shaped to address specific threats from China. It doesn't. It doesn't. Some would argue that this is a contrivance to mislead the countries. Others would say, let's take it at face value and see if we can actually work with this. So let me close with some observations on how what's happening in Ukraine will affect the future of the Quad and perceptions of the Quad. I'll start with the idea of revitalizing, reshaping international alliances and partnerships. And the Biden administration is careful to always use the dual formula and say, we know who the allies are, who are the partners. I think the simple answer is anybody that is willing and able to work with us in tackling common problems. That a positive values basis to groupings of countries. And here, Ukraine, I think I may have made this point in a previous lecture, that NATO as a defensive military alliance actually doesn't have much rationale for the kind of engagement that we're having with Ukraine. But NATO as a grouping of nations with shared values, shared commitment to peace, stability, sovereignty, non-interference in internal affairs, defense of governments anywhere that embody these values is quite different than membership of adjacent territories that stop the enemy at my neighbor's border so I don't have to stop them at my own. It's a very different rationale for alliances than what seems to be undergirding the Quad or the reconceptualization of what NATO is for and why it exists. Another lesson coming out of Ukraine for much of the world, and certainly to include China, because it is articulated this more loudly, if not more often than others, that had declared the decline of the West in general and the United States in particular. The American century is over. The centuries of Western dominance are over. That the US no longer able to lead the world, even the free world, even the democratic, so-called democratic world. What's happening right now in Europe undercuts that argument. The way in which the nations of Europe have pulled together and the way in which the United States has contributed to, but not been out in front of this effort, undercuts the logic and the arguments, the assumptions of a number of other nations' foreign policies that have been, whether they're preparing for the worst, hedging against the possibility of US decline, or eager to take advantage of a perceived US decline of the West, has to go back and rethink this. It's at a minimum been challenged. In the case of China, the Quad looks more formidable because of lessons coming out of Ukraine. It's not just that the US isn't in decline, is that for a decade now, a high-profile alignment with Russia has been the centerpiece of China's foreign policy. And the assumption that the appearance that that is a strong relationship gives China both leverage in its own activities around the world, leverage in dealing with the United States and Japan and Europe, and protection against overreaction to China's more assertive moves. The idea that a response that threatens China would also have to consider how the Russians will respond has been a key part of China's foreign policy. Russia doesn't look so formidable now. It doesn't look like it's a very useful ally. And the extent that China stands with, supports Russia in its invasion of Ukraine, it completely alienates all of China's major trade partners. It's really made the Europeans even more anti-China than they had been before the invasion. And China's figuring out, does it dump the Soviet Union and stand there alone? How does it adjust to a West that is more united than it has ever appeared in the era of reform and opening that began in 1979 in China? That do they continue to strengthen the military? Do they really enter into an arms race? Do they want an arms race with the coordinated efforts of the Quad? I'm sure the answer is no. But how do they avoid it? And how can we, the United States, as a member of the Quad, avoid an arms race that will be costly and dangerous for everybody? Assumptions that the lure of the China market would cause the greedy capitalists to fracture, that one or another would break from the rest of the European Union, that they'd break with the United States, break with Japan. And in fact, the opposite has happened, that more countries have signed on to the sanctions and the condemnation than belong to any of the pre-existing alliance and formal partnership arrangements. Putin's actions have been at least as important as, in my view, as Biden's efforts to revitalize alliances and the perceived value of collective security. That collective security in Asia has been notable mostly by its absence. Because of the legacy of the Second World War, countries did not want to be aligned with Japan. And that World War II legacy is pretty well gone, except in South Korea, North Korea, and China. It may be possible now in a way that was never possible before for US leadership to bring together something like a regional security arrangement, which is important not simply for its military might and combined military might, but because you can't have a viable alliance without a great deal of transparency, without a great deal of cooperation and division of labor, things that require trust and build trust. And I will argue, I have argued for some time, that it's impossible to conceive of the European Union without NATO. NATO came first. Habits of trust and cooperation developed in response to the perceived necessity to counter the Soviet threat that then made it possible to have much larger elements of economic and political cooperation. The Quad may begin to play that kind of role in East Asia, to build some architectural supports that enhance stability and facilitate prosperity. Let me stop there because I have used up more than the time Lou gave me and turn it over to your questions. And hopefully I've made the confusing subject of the Quad a little more understandable. Lou?
Thank you very much, Tom. The first question comes from Robert, and it really is focused on the US and India. The point being that over the past 40 years, India used to be much closer to the Soviet Union. Evidence the fact that India's military uses, or at least once used, Russian equipment. What has driven India to build closer relations with the United States? Robert's point is that he believes this major change started long before Modi became the Prime Minister of India.
Robert, thank you for the question. That let me go back to the end of the Cold War. That the demise of the Soviet Union, in conjunction with China's success, tremendous economic success in moving away from the Stalinist version of a socialist planned economic model, changed thinking in India, at many other countries. India, like many other countries that gained independence after World War II, adopted a variant of Stalinist heavy industry-led minimum export substitution, buy as little as you can from other countries, develop a comprehensive economy. So the model for India, for Nehruvian socialism, had clearly failed. The Soviet Union went into eclipse. The Chinese that had that model moved away from it, demonstrated success. That combination caused India to begin to change its own economy substantially. And that the changes to the economy made it of interest to the United States and to Europe in ways that it had not been when the economy is closed. Now there's perceived opportunity for investment, for trade, for technological cooperation that wasn't there. And so the lure of 1.3 billion people, English-speaking people, was real. So it gave us a greater incentive. The Soviet Union is gone as China's partner and, in that sense, protector from the perceived threat from China. And India perceives China as its greatest security threat. Feeling a little naked in the international system, India became more interested in using the United States as a counterbalance to the China threat. So we were more interested in them for economic reasons. They were more interested in us for security reasons. But India remains very strongly committed to the ideas of independence, non-alignment, neutralism. It insists it will not become an ally of the United States. It wasn't a formal ally of the Soviet Union, but it's leaning towards us. Something I probably should have mentioned in my remarks about the Quad. In the response to the invasion of Ukraine, India has adopted a position of not criticizing Putin, not criticizing Russia. How could a country that has respect for sovereignty, for non-alignment, independence, as a part of its political mantra for decades, not criticize this war, this invasion? And I think the answer is good old geopolitics. If India were to break completely with Russia, it's not just to depend on the Russians for weapons. They could buy weapons other places. It's that would leave them with no obvious alternative but to come closer to the United States that makes them comfortable. They'd rather have us in their corner without being tied to us. And that's a political consideration in Indian democracy, that the judgment that the public would not abide by a formal alliance, being too closely tied to the United States as the descendant of the United Kingdom, the former colonial masters, and the current global hegemon. I hope that gets to the question.
Thank you, Tom. A couple of questions here specific to the quote unquote Quad. First question from Jim, why is South Korea not a member of the Quad? And does South Korea not want to join?
That is a perfect question. that if democracy is to be the principal criterion for membership, why is South Korea out? And why is India, in light of the erosion of the tolerant aspects of a liberal democracy in? India is going the wrong way in its treatment of minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities. That South Korea looks a lot better as a vibrant, thriving democratic state. The short answer is the Japanese will be reluctant to do anything. They won't, the Japanese and the Koreans, both very reluctant to do anything in a trilateral arrangement with the United States. Drives us nuts when I was a policy official, having to do everything twice, having to have separate arrangements. You tell the Koreans, but you couldn't tell the Japanese. You tell the Japanese and couldn't tell the Koreans, kinds of things. That there's that problem with the South Koreans that don't want to be in a club where the Japanese are, don't want to be the younger brother in a club where the Japanese are a founding member, that kind of consideration. But the Quad has already begun to use the contrivance of the Quad Plus. And one of the plus has been South Korea. The idea is on a case by case, problem by problem, concern by concern. You can have different players. It's not an exclusive club. If you're a South Korean, it says, it looks like I'm allowed to come in through the back door. Why can't I come through the front door like a real cherished member? I think this is going to get sorted out. By any logic for the Quad, including those that I tried to lay out, it belongs inside the club.
Thank you. Another sort of related question is, how does the Quad relate to ASEAN and Vietnam?
How does the Quad relate to ASEAN first? ASEAN is not thrilled with the Quad, in part because of the notion of ASEAN centrality that was discussed in Scott Mercier's talk last week, that the Quad is a little bit of a workaround. It's impatient. ASEAN can't decide what day of the week it is, let alone an important issue. And the idea is that this grouping of democracies with shared interests can act and does not need to bow to or defer to obtaining consensus in the highly fractured. ASEAN is not a bunch of like-thinking countries. Cambodia and Laos are very, very different than Singapore or Indonesia, for example, in terms of political systems and orientation. That the, why am I blanking on the second group? Was ASEAN plus?
The next question was related, how does the Quad relate to Vietnam?
Vietnam. Well, Vietnam is a member of ASEAN. Vietnam is very suspicious, skeptical of, in some respects, hostile to China, that these are two Communist Party state systems does not overcome centuries of antagonism, bullying, effects of bullying by China of Vietnamese fishermen and oil exploration rigs and so forth in the South China Sea. And Vietnam is certainly not a democracy, although it is a part of TPP. TPP continues to exist without us. It's now called the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, with Japan in the lead as the organizer. And Vietnam is a part of that grouping because it shares an increasing number of interests, but not yet values. I think Vietnam is quite happy to have the Quad in existence. Even years ago in Hanoi, in meetings with officials, they talked about India plus Vietnam as the counter to China. They did it arithmetically, that Vietnam plus India gave as many people as existed in China at the time, which is a kind of a silly way to think about it. But India in is good. Relationship with the United States, that's good. Japan, not a particular problem. The war legacy. In Vietnam, the memory is the Japanese in World War II threw the French out and proclaimed an Asia for Asians approach that was consistent with the ideology of the Indochina Communist Party. And Australia, it's okay that it's in, but they certainly don't oppose it. Would they be likely to cooperate with it on a lot of things? Probably, if asked. Lou?
Yes, follow-on question from Carol about additional members. What about Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia? They're not perfect democracies, but much better than ASEAN, and collectively they do have a lot of influence / power.
This is an important question, not because you posed it to me, but for the future of the Quad. That what should be the criteria for expansion? Should it be expansion of core members? Should it be Quad plus various groupings that are around problem solving? My sense is that what the Biden administration seeks and what the other members of the Quad would think preferable is a groupings based on task, that a grouping that is based on some malleable definition of democracy is not the objective. The objective is to have a group of countries that can work together to solve specific problems. Now, for some of them, problem number one is what do you do about China? But the other kinds of issues being addressed in this Great Decisions series and being listed in the summit document from the Quad, sure, it makes sense to have Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, a part of it, but probably not for the total agenda, not for the, how hard do you want to make it to get consensus before doing anything? And for every country you add to a grouping, you more than multiply the complexity of getting consensus. So if or to the extent that the purpose is to get things done, diverting attention to organization building and maintenance is counterproductive. And my sense of where the Quad countries want to go is towards getting things done to make what others want to associate with this mechanism to tackle real problems, to be the go-to place, rather than a club that they'd like to join. Don't want a club that they have to pay dues for or take on security obligations. But want to have the opportunity to join in as it is in their interest to do so.
Okay. So I think we're down to the point here of saying, why isn't such and so in? Next country that got mentioned is the Philippines.
Mhm. Well, Philippines is a flawed democracy. It may be a better democracy after the current president, Duterte, is replaced in the upcoming election. But it doesn't have nearly as much to contribute. So I think even though it is a US ally, even though it is more than a nominal democratic system, it would have difficulty transcending why would you want to go through the hassle of incorporating Philippines into the organization? And for the Philippines, it would rekindle concerns about animosity toward anything that looked like a restoration of the American bases, the American military relationship with the Philippines, which was terminated in 1992, when the Philippines, under the guise of wanting us out, wanted a lot more money paid for the base access. Soviet Union is gone, and they said, if you don't pay, you have to leave. And the Americans surprised them by saying, we'll leave. But the political sensitivity and the memories of suppression of the Philippine Revolution early in the last century and so are still quite raw. So again, this one would be a hard sell on both sides.
And from a geographical standpoint, what about all the parties that are worried about the South China Sea? Is that a criterion that might be used for quote unquote expansion?
Not for expansion, but for undertaking. That a part of the lead up to the revitalization of interest in the Quad, as I very briefly summarized, was Japan's, under then Prime Minister Abe's, call for a free and open Indo-Pacific. The open is freedom of navigation. It was linked to Japanese, Chinese disagreements, clashes over some territories, some islands off of Okinawa, and interference with freedom of navigation. Similarly, in the South China Sea, that the Quad countries send, except for India, send vast amounts of material goods through the South China Sea. I think it's something like $6 trillion a year that flows in those shipping lanes. So it's the freedom of navigation. It's adherence to the UN Law of the Sea agreement that specifies what type of feature in the sea is entitled to exclusive economic zones or exclusive territorial waters and the like, all of which are issues that puts most of the region in opposition to China plus India. India doesn't have claims in the South China Sea, but it has the same interpretation of what the Law of the Sea agreement allows and requires. The claimants, the Southeast Asian claimants in the South China Sea the ones that have the direct beef with Chinese fish police disrupting their fishing fleets and the like, and from the Southeast Asian perspective, poaching on their fishing grounds, cannot agree among themselves on a code of conduct, on ownership of uninhabitable rocks. So until they get their own act together on this, there's not an obvious way to incorporate them as a unit into some undertakings. So the approach is to subsume their concerns under the free and open Indo-Pacific rubric, that the Seventh Fleet, the Australian fleet, the Japanese fleet can freely sail these waters and can sail in collaboration, in cooperation, division of labor, patrol together, and so forth. And that being out there deters not just pirates, but it deters China or India from bothersome military activities.
Okay. I have one last question, but before that, there are a number of comments here thanking you once again, Tom, for a great presentation, for answering the individual's questions. So this is the last question, and then after you answer that, if you could just give us a preview of next week, and then
Sure.
then I'll close. So the question is, whatever happened to the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization? Does that still exist? What gives?
It went away. That it basically evaporated before the Vietnam War picked up in intensity when it changed from an anti-French to an anti-US operation, that countries just drifted away. And the United States didn't do much, but my memory, it didn't do anything to maintain its existence. That the US had the arrangements that it needed for Vietnam in the form of bilateral treaties with Thailand and the Philippines. Access to air bases in Thailand, naval bases and air bases in the Philippines. And after the demise of the Soviet Union, we didn't think we needed to be that extended or to pay the political price to maintain the bases, the stationing of troops, the status of forces kinds of agreements, and just began to retrenchment that began under Nixon, replaced by something called the Nixon Doctrine that entrusted the first line of responsibilities to our partners and allies, not to the United States. So the CEDAW Treaty became superfluous. I guess I should move right into, thanks to those who thanked me for the talk. I do appreciate that. I hope this was worthwhile for everybody. Next week, we're going to have another very able and knowledgeable speaker. Rod Schoonover is a scientist who one point worked for me in the State Department doing environmental, climate, ecological issues. He later worked for the National Intelligence Council on these issues. Some of you may recognize his name. During the Trump administration, he resigned in protest of the administration's blocking of a study on the effects of climate change that he and other scientists in the government had done. So he's now at Georgetown University, but Rod knows his stuff. So I'm looking forward to his talk next week. So thank you all again for coming. This and the other talks that have been recorded and are available on the First Church website, on the subsite for Great Decisions, and hope to see all of you and bring your friends next week to learn about climate change.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. And I'll send out a note out when the recording is available. Thanks again to everybody for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now and then stop the meeting. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your evening. Good night.
Good night, all.